Funding for this program is made possible by Burke Nursery and Garden Center in Burke, Virginia. You'll find trees and shrubs, perennials and annuals, water garden supplies, houseplants, and bird and gardening supplies. Burke Nursery also provides landscape, plant diagnostic, and installation services, as well as the October month-long Pumpkin Playground Festival featuring hay rides and much more. For more information, you can check out their website or call 703-323-1188. Welcome to Gardening with Burke Nursery, the show where we help you grow your garden and increase the curb appeal of your yard. I'm your host, Misty Kuceris, the horticulturalist at Burke Nursery and Garden Center. Many of us living in Northern Virginia have old homes with mature trees, and with fall coming up, you may think that you can't have any fall blooming flowers. But I'm here to share some of my favorite perennials that'll bring that spark to your shade garden and continue blooming well into the fall. So join me as I show you some fantastic fall blooming shade perennials. You know, one of the most common questions that I get this time of year are, can I plant perennials in the fall? Yes, please plant perennials in the fall. You can also plant trees, shrubs, and of course grass seed. The reason fall planting works so well is that temperatures are lower and the stress on the plants is lower. They don't need as much water for their roots to grow because they lose less water through what we call transpiration. It's kind of when your plants perspire. They also actually have more energy that they put into growing their root system. So when spring comes around and these perennials surface from their winter dormancy, you have a lot stronger root system and better flowering. So today, let me share some of the perennials that you can grow in your shade garden and that give you that fall interest, as well as keeping your pollinators happy. Well, perhaps a lot of you, all you think about when you're thinking about fall planting when it comes to perennials are your mums, or maybe your asters, or maybe you're thinking of the annuals of pansies, or you're even thinking of the annuals of ornamental cabbage, and you go, wait a minute, that's for sun. Well, I am serious when I say that we definitely have perennials that you can grow in the shade. The first perennial that I want to talk about is called Turtlehead. Now, here's my little secret. I only have a picture to show you of Turtlehead. What happened is that I have a drainage problem in my front yard, and I have created a bog garden. And when I was looking at some plants, some perennials that I could use for fall interest to put into my bog garden, I discovered the Turtlehead. The one that I have is with pink flowers, and there are some that have white flowers and others that have red flowers. And to me, this is a very majestic plant. The plant in the pot itself, before I planted it, was 2 feet tall by 1 foot wide. And this plant is actually going to grow up to 3 feet. And it's just beautiful. It loves wet conditions. It's a native plant. You find it in the areas of swamps, bogs. You find it in the areas of floodplains. You find it in marshes. So if you have a drainage problem, this, and not only the drainage problem, but also you have shade, then this is a plant to definitely consider. Not only is it a native to the United States, but it's also very, very popular in Germany and England. And it blooms from late summer until fall for about 3 to 6 weeks. It'll even bloom longer. As I said, it can get up to 5 feet tall, and it can spread. One plant can spread 5 feet. This may be frightening to some of you, but if you want to keep it a little shorter and you want to make it what we call more compact, then in midsummer, before the fall season begins, you literally prune the plant in half, and then what you're going to find is that it grows sturdier, and also it doesn't fall over. Hummingbirds love it, butterflies love it. Deer do not. It is definitely deer resistant. Of course, in our area, you may want to say deer less eaten because sadly, if deer are hungry enough, they'll eat anything. Well, the next plant that I'd like to show you is also what we call a bog plant. This plant the plant in the pot doesn't even do justice. This plant, when it is fully grown, will be 8 feet tall. It has these leaves here, and we'll call these leaves a rosette. So you get all these leaves that grow, and then you will get, this is a different plant here, but this plant is very similar, has very similar spikes to what the Bugbane or Snakeroot plant will get once it's fully grown. It takes 3 to 5 years for it to get flowers. So you need to be very, very patient. And is it deer resistant? Yes. Rabbit resistant? Yes. The flowers, they're spikes they almost look like little plumes of white, but you never want to divide them because if you divide them, you'll have to wait another 3 to 5 years to bloom. And it has a huge taproot once established. There's a reason that it's called snakeroot, and that's because Native Americans would use the taproot when they needed to have an antidote or when they had injury from snake bites. So they would actually use the roots of this plant. If you have a huge place or if you have a bog garden, this is a plant to consider, and it loves the shade. Also, this plant loves clay soil. So it's very, very happy here in the Virginia area. The next plant that I'd like to show you technically is not a spring blooming plant, in honesty. Technically, it's not a fall blooming plant. Excuse me, misspoke again. It technically is a spring blooming plant. But there's a reason that I wanted to show this to you. And this plant is called a Foamflower plant. Let me move this out of the way. There. I want to make sure our camera operators can see this much better, then that means you see it better as well. But the reason I recommend this for the fall garden is that after it loses its spikes, flowers, which actually sometimes flowers bloom out of season. I mean, I have one flower that's a spring bloomer that's still blooming in my yard. I have no idea why, but it likes it there, I guess. So these are blooming out of season, but when these go away, you have these incredible leaves, and you can already see it. The leaves are starting to turn red in the center. And as the fall progresses, they will continue to turn red. And it is such a beautiful color. These leaves are evergreen, and evergreen means they never die back in the winter months. So this plant only gets about 12 inches tall, and it is a fantastic ground cover for the shade. So if you want to plant it under your tree, if you want to plant it under your shrubs, this plays well with the roots of trees and shrubs. It actually enjoys being planted in those areas. And you may get tired. I mean, what are your usual plants that you plant under your trees and shrubs? They're usually Pachysandra, which is also known as Japanese spurge, or they're also Vinca minor, which is also known as periwinkle. And if you're really wanting to plant native plants and you want a native plant that's a shade cover, then this plant is the one to go for. Now, that baby likes to get married, as I say, to another baby, the coral bell. Yes, someone actually bred these in the 1800s, crossed them, and came up with a new flower. Your coral bell in most areas is also evergreen, and it's, again, this is a spring bloomer, but if it's evergreen in your neighborhood, look at these leaves. Just look how phenomenal they are. And then it gets these spikes. And the coral bell wants a little bit more sun. This Foamflower, total shade. And then the coral bell gives birth to what we call the foamy bells, which again is another spring flower, but and you can't see it on this one. The foamy bells actually get more flowers than the coral bells, but the leaves are very similar to the leaves of the coral bells. And one other thing, there was another reason that I wanted to bring this plant in to show you. Sometimes what happens as we're coming close to fall, especially if you have plants that are spring bloomers, they may go through a little bit of what I call sulking. So you may see a little bit of water spots which have a little fungus on them, but don't worry about that. That's not going to create a problem. So the next plant that I'd like to, unfortunately though, there is one thing about the Foamflower. Even though the Foamflower makes a wonderful ground cover, it is not deer resistant. So that is the one thing that you need, that may be a drawback to using it as a ground cover. Now my new favorite plant is actually from Japan, from Taiwan, from Asia. Brought in two of these. And the toad lily. I'm trying to think of the best way to, maybe if I did that, you could really see that flower. The toad lily is totally a fall blooming perennial. And its flower to me looks like the flower of some of the orchids that I've seen. It's just gorgeous. And it also, I love the leaves. These are typical leaves that you'll see with lilies. And it grows up on spikes. And there's two types of toad lilies. There's one that we call clumping. So that means that it basically stays in a form as it spreads. And then there's those that are called spreaders. How could I forget that? But these, as a matter of fact, this is the Sumeri variety. And there's really only two varieties that basically make it to the United States, and this is one of them. But this one is known as a spreader, which means that if you really want to put it in your garden, not only do you want to find a shady location in your garden, but you want to find it because as a spreader, it doesn't get that tall. It might get to 10 inches tall, maybe a little taller, but it's nice to have it as kind of a showpiece where someone walking up to your home, it's fall, the season is cool, nobody's thinking of flowers, and then suddenly they get a glimpse of an entire garden area with the toad lily. It is deer resistant, so that's the nice thing, and it will, if you do want to divide it, you can either divide it in the spring or early spring, which would mean March, or you can divide it in fall. But I personally would divide it in spring to give it a better root structure since it flowers in the fall. The next plant is the Anenome. And no, we're not at the ocean. This is really a plant. There's this plant hasn't started blooming yet, but I do have a picture of what the blooms look like. They are phenomenal. The blooms can actually get as wide as 4 inches. Isn't that amazing? And the anemone, the Japanese anemone, obviously is not a native plant. It's also called a windflower plant. And the windflower, because, well, at least this is the belief, is that a lot of them like to grow in windy locations. So you may want to think about that. And you're not going to believe this, perhaps, from the pot, but you're looking at 5 feet tall when you're looking at the height of this plant. Can you imagine in a shade garden? Oh, and the other thing is this plant actually will work in a full sun garden as well. It may need staking. Unlike the first 2 plants I talked about, which were bog plants, no, this one does not like water. You really need to be careful with planting it and making sure that you plant it in a well-drained area. Otherwise, it'll get root rot. Bees love it. Butterflies love it. It is deer resistant, but here's where you need to be very, very cautious. If you have small children, then you may not want to plant this. Or if you have dogs or cats that like to eat plants, I wouldn't recommend planting it. Unfortunately, as beautiful as this is, and as much as people love this plant, all parts of it actually are poisonous. So you need to be very careful if you're going to plant it. But still, with the flowers, I just did need to show you this plant. So be very, very cautious if you decide to plant it. So the last plant that I'd like to discuss for your garden is perhaps a plant that everybody thinks of anyways, and this is your fern. Ferns are very popular in any shade garden, and there are so many different types of ferns. But this one here specifically is what we call a Christmas fern. That means that this fern is evergreen. And again, evergreen means it never loses its leaves. The other ferns will actually die back for the winter months and only come back when it's spring. But your Christmas fern, it's there in your garden all the time. And it gives you a nice interest. Yes, it doesn't really flower, but it gives that continuous green look, and that's so nice. Also, in some parts of the country, in this part of the country, it's called Christmas fern, but in some parts of the country, it's actually called holly fern. And this is a clumper. What that means is your ferns that die back in the winter months, when they come back, they start spreading. But this fern actually just grows taller and taller. It doesn't really spread the way that the other ferns spread. So if you want to use this fern as if you want to have a lot of these ferns, then you actually need to plant these closely. And today we'll talk a little bit about how to plant some of these plants. But usually when you talk about planting plants, you usually talk about planting them a foot apart, or you talk about planting them 2 or 3 feet apart. But with this Christmas fern, if you want a lot of them, then basically, let's see, we'll pretend that this is another Christmas fern. We know it's not, but basically you'd be planting the Christmas ferns just 3 or 4 inches apart. You'd be planting them fairly tight. Now, Christmas ferns have a great root system. And if you have an area where you have an erosion problem, just have to admit, I'm sorry about that little noise you folks heard there. I forgot where the mic ended. So if you have an erosion problem, then what you want to do is plant, and if it's a shade area erosion problem, and you plant the Christmas ferns, because the roots are so tight and the roots work so well, that what happens is it can prevent erosion in that area. Great plant for shade when you have problems with erosion. And of course, it is deer resistant, it's rabbit resistant, and there are some people, I read this once, but I've never really found the documentation totally supported, but I love the story, so I always share this story, that the reason it's called the Christmas fern is that when settlers first came to the United States, what they found was the Christmas fern in the winter months, and they thought it was beautiful, and they would use it to decorate their homes for the winter Christmas celebrations. So like I said, I don't know how accurate, or if that's a story that just somebody decided to make up because it sounded good, but it does sound good, so I'm spreading the story. And the other thing that's very important is this fern is actually very critical to birds. Why is it critical to birds? Well, as the fern is growing and it cascades a little, during the winter months, there's not really a lot out there for birds to hide behind or for birds to shelter. And they are able to shelter inside this fern and protect themselves during the winter months. So that's another reason to plant the winter fern. One of the things that I'd like to do, since we have time, is talk about some techniques that can help you when you plant your perennials. Not just these fall shade perennials, but any perennials. So let me get some of my tools here. One of my tools that I have here is a knife. Another tool, here is scissors. Another tool is a moisture meter, which may sound like a strange tool, but there's actually a reason for this tool. Most of your shade plants come from areas of the woodlands, where the woodlands have a lot of moisture. Other shade plants come from bog areas. It's rare that shade plants come from dry areas. Now your sun plants, they tend to come from areas that are dry. And a lot of people will ask me, because it's very important when you first plant, that for at least the first several months before we hit winter, because you could plant these now if you want, then you want to keep watering them, but you may not know how much water to give it, or you may not know if it's moist enough or not moist enough. And that's where a water meter is so handy. And my recommendation, this one I've had for 10 years, maybe longer. So it's just a moisture tester. And all you do is to test the moisture is you just stick it in the soil, and it will tell me on a scale of 1 to 4, 4 being too wet, 1 being too dry, whether or not you need to water that plant. And if it's halfway between the end of 2 and the start of 3, then you know your plant's perfectly watered. So you may find that initially you need to water once a week, or you may find you, depending on how dry or how windy it is, you may need to water it actually more. You may need to water it every second or every third day until the plant's established. Once the plant's established, you're fine. The next thing is that this is my little garden, shall we say, my little cloth. And you always want to make certain that you never dig the hole deeper than the pot, because we have clay soil here, and we want this base to sit so that the roots extend sideways. But we want this much surface area to be dug up so that we have all this loose soil. And you want to put a little fertilizer in, preferably a 5-10-5 or something where that middle number, the phosphorus is a lot higher than the nitrogen and the other. And then I always recommend water the pot thoroughly. Now, I didn't water these because we have the show, but after it's watered thoroughly, it's easier to get out. And then you check the roots. If the roots look good like this, then what you do is you just loosen the roots a little bit and put it in the soil and plant it. If the roots aren't loose, then you just take your knife and put some slits around there, and then you're ready to plant, and then water. I hope that you enjoyed learning about fantastic fall blooming shade perennials. I'm your host, Misty Kuceris, and I'd like to thank you for spending your time with me here at Gardening with Burke Nursery. I'm looking forward to helping you grow your garden.
Funding for this program is made possible by Burke Nursery and Garden Center in Burke, Virginia. You'll find trees and shrubs, perennials and annuals, water garden supplies, houseplants, and bird and gardening supplies. Burke Nursery also provides landscape, plant diagnostic, and installation services, as well as the October month-long Pumpkin Playground Festival featuring hay rides and much more. For more information, you can check out their website or call 703-323-1188.